The status quo doesn't cut it. The status quo is killing people. We had funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral. We don't have a system that's set up for our children who are traumatised, whether they're white or black, anywhere in Australia. We just don't. There's no rocket science in it. If you asked any family of any colour around the world, they would say the same. We want our kids to know their land, their language, their culture. We want them to have great jobs. We want them to be healthy. We want them to be strong in their identity.
Thanks so much for doing this, Jane.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Could we start by learning a little bit about Children's Ground before we get into your story?
Yeah, so I'm very privileged to be the CEO of Children's Ground, which is a First Nations not-for-profit organisation led by incredible First Nations leaders and elders. It continues a journey that many First Nations, certainly the elders and families who lead Children's Ground, have been on for generations, but it is an exciting, audacious 25-year strategy for systemic reform to ensure the next generation of First Nations children, or any child for that matter, who lives in complex inequity and injustice, can have complete pathways to well-being. So for us in our communities, that means putting in place a very clear plan that's based on First Nations knowledge systems and governance, which are quite brilliant and have evolved for over 65,000 years, making sure that that's at the heart of what we do. And when you do that, the laws and life for Aboriginal people all start from the land, and there's a very, very strong governance system that then defines health systems, education systems, legal systems. Everything you can imagine sits within the First Nations realm, but most people don't have visibility to that. So in many ways it's very simple. It's a 25-year approach that privileges people's solutions, governance, leadership, culture, language. But we ensure that whole communities are working in concert and that they lead for their community, because each community is slightly different and the law of the land must come from that place. So it gives local agency and it encaptures all children within that community, so that we're building a pathway that privileges them and creates opportunities where their identity is at the heart of everything, which is fundamental to their mental health and well-being and their otnanga, or their spirit, but where they're also gaining the skill sets that they need within the Western context. So they're not fractured in their identity. They don't have to be First Nations in one place and non-First Nations in another to be accepted, but that they can be accepted, respected, understood and valued as First Nations children, young people and adults within a global context with all the freedoms that people should have, economically, socially, culturally.
And I'm really interested to find out how you ended up getting involved in this work and living in the Northern Territory. But can we go back to the very beginning, which is how you grew up?
Well, I grew up in what you'd consider to be a pretty standard Australian home in many ways, in the suburbs of Victoria. But I was born in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. My father was in the army at that time. But what was different in our family is that my father came to Australia during the White Australia policy. He was one of the first and oldest, not one of the first, but one of the oldest sort of living migrants. He only passed away last year at the age of 96, but he came as a coloured man at a time where this country was incredibly white and the policies were all about white Australia. And he married my mother in the 60s, when it was still not usual to have, white and black relationships. And so, my mother's quite an exceptional, beautiful, amazing woman who is still alive today, and she lives with Alzheimer's. My father and her raised us to believe in in ourselves and our ability and our rights, and whilst he had to work very hard as a migrant that had come from another country. He managed to get himself into the area that he wanted, which was he wanted to do medicine, but for a range of barriers couldn't. And then he studied and drove taxis and became a dentist and then a facial-maxillary surgeon. So we grew up with economic privilege, really, but both of them came from, my grandfather was a paddy farmer in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and my mother came from a single parent household, and my grandmother was in Housing Commission in Sydney. So, within a generation they turned it around so that we grew up with a lot of privilege. We had schooling, we all went to university, and I was very, very fortunate. So, back then when I was growing up in Melbourne, I was still one of the only coloured person in my year, apart from my brothers in primary school. And I think there was one other coloured girl in my year in secondary school. So, we didn't have the sort of diversity, certainly where I lived, in the way that we do today. So, but, I was given confidence by my mother, who is Anglo, and, just raised us to believe in ourselves, and we were very, very fortunate. So I came through with the ability to make decisions freely, because I had that backing through my family, and they had worked tirelessly to be able to give us that privilege. So I felt very fortunate, and I was able to go to university, at Monash University, and do psychology, and I did my master's in psychology. But I always had a very strong drive for justice, or a very passionate and vehement opposition to injustice. Right through my schooling, I would stand up for others who were being discriminated against, and I certainly experienced some of that discrimination myself, but it was okay. I felt confident enough to manage that, but I was aware of the way we, the cruelty between children and adults, and whether it's racial discrimination or other discrimination, has been something that has been on my radar since I was pretty young. So I went through university, and I did a master's in forensic psychology. And as part of that, we visited the prison system here in Victoria when Pentridge Prison was still functioning, and it was the, grey stone walls of an archaic prison which housed, maximum security prisoners. And I remember walking through those walls and just being shocked that we would still imprison people in this way at this time. These were prisons that were built, when this place was colonised, So, locking people up in these tiny cubicles and treating them as dogs. And I knew at that time I wanted to work there, from that first visit. And so I managed to get a job there, and that started my career in psychology.
So was it like you wanted to go in and treat these people as humans?
I didn't. That's sort of part of it, but just I wanted to bring some humanity and dignity into a place that was void. And you realise that we don't have a justice system. When you work in this area, we don't have a justice system. We have an injustice system, and the people that are behind bars are always the people who have less money, less opportunity. Look at the statistics for First Nations people. How can nearly 30% of our prison population be First Nations, when it's only 3% of the general population? That in itself shows the level of discrimination. And you look at the prisons in Victoria, and now, it's different to when I was first worked in the prisons 25 years ago or longer, 30 years ago. A huge sort of refugee shift in that time, but we have so many refugees now in prison, and Sudanese people, and it's incredibly discriminatory. So the justice system is set up to catch those that don't have the wherewithal, don't have the money, don't have the resources, and don't have the lawyers to be able to defend themselves. And And then we treat people very, very poorly, and we treat them inhumanely. And it's not that, I prescribe to people breaking the law. I don't do that at all. But I believe that every single person should be treated with dignity and respect. And when I walked through those walls, I was disgusted that we would treat anybody like that. And I worked with some of the serious, violent offenders in Victoria at that time. And what I found in that time was many, many men who themselves had been traumatised as children, who had come through a system that was a bit of a treadmill towards prison, where they were accepted and, could find their belonging amongst, the going into, so if you think about the trajectory, if you live with that level of trauma, very hard to concentrate in school, very hard to do well in school. You sort of get, identified as the problem child or the bully or the this or that, and then that gets set up to be the thing that you're good at if you're not good at anything else. And you can't sit in a classroom and concentrate because you're thinking about the trauma, or you're emotionally heightened from what has happened the night before and basic survival. So we don't have a system that's set up for our children who are traumatised, whether they're white or black, anywhere in Australia. We just don't. And so we find many of those people end up in jail, and we have huge comorbidity of mental health in jails, people with high anxiety, depression, mental health issues. So, I was really determined. It was just a place I wanted to work in because, I was driven by the injustice and wanted to see and work in a place that hopefully I could bring a different bent, I guess, a different opportunity, a different place of dignity for people, to see people who are never seen, they're just labelled. And I learnt so much in the 4 years that I worked there.
Do you have a sense of where your strong sense for justice came from?
Look, I think it's my mother and my father in combination, but in really different ways. My father was pretty absent when I was growing up. He just worked and worked and worked. But we knew of his challenges as a man of colour in Australia, not being able to get rental accommodation, not being able to get, whatever it was. There were barriers to him all along, even in the army where he wasn't promoted, he could only get so far. But he didn't speak to that very much. He told us the stories, but he didn't rally against it. He wasn't he didn't verbalise it a lot, but we were aware of those barriers. But my mother was probably the justice, champion in our family as an Anglo woman. She just would not stand for anybody being treated poorly. Didn't matter who they were. So she was much more vocal about that. So we grew up with a very strong sense of respect for others, rights of others, our own privilege, the inequities in society. My grandmother, her mother, was a complete socialist on that end, and so she grew up in a really small country town where she wasn't allowed to continue study as a child, my grandmother, and she ran away from that and went to Sydney and mixed with people that who were incredibly socially progressive and around those social justice and rights. So I think it actually comes from my line through my mother, that really strong sense of justice and our obligation to respond to injustices.
So where did you go after working in prisons? And did you feel like you could have an impact in that?
Look, I worked in the maximum security prison. I worked in a place called K Division, and that was an area that had been set up. It was called Jaika in the early days. It was meant to be set up as a very, very high security prison that had part of Pentridge. That didn't quite function well, but they kept part of that. So they kept a few arms of Jaika for, the most high-risk prisoners in Victoria. And then they created part of it as a therapeutic hub. So I ran the therapeutic services there, and they were 3-month programs with men who had high recidivist, history and violence and alcohol and other drugs. So did I make a difference? Well, I don't know. I would hope that in the lives of some of those men to create some pathways for them to understand their histories and their opportunities and to build different... there were two things. One was working with trauma, and very, very serious and deep trauma. A lot of those men had been tortured themselves as children, and they became perpetrators themselves. So understanding where their behaviours had come from and being able to understand their own trauma, which most of them had never spoken about. You can imagine in prison, most people don't talk about the sexual abuse or the violent abuse that they'd experienced as children. And we would do that in a group setting. So it was quite a powerful environment to have these big burly men with tattoos and, walking around with watermelons on their arms and sitting down, and then being incredibly gentle with one another and sharing their stories with one another and showing humility. And when you work in a prison where people have lost everything and you've lost your freedom, you have nothing left. So there's a vulnerability and a truth that was incredibly powerful, and I will always remember those days. And I think I learned more from the men than I probably was able to, provide support to them for. I have remained in contact with one of those men over all these years, his whole family. And it hasn't been an easy journey. It's not an easy journey when that's where you end up as an adult, to break those cycles. So did I have an impact? Probably minimally, in terms of the lives of some of those men. But trying to bring... I then co-established a company called Arrernte Services, because everything became privatised. I'd been working there under the government. And that company of psychologists continues today, and I hope that I've influenced their journey as one of the founding directors, and with some great colleagues that I have, and they've continued on working in the prison system. So, I hope in some ways I've contributed to some humanity.
Yeah, of course. But I guess even if you took those lessons and now you're providing them on this huge scale to change the systems, because I'm kind of wondering if you just in that experience thought, okay, that we need to look at the whole system and how...
Completely. Absolutely. The system is set up in a way that creates massive exclusions. If you're on the margins, if you're not economically well, if you're not somebody from the middle or the upper class, life is hard. And even if you're not within the prison system, it is a full-time job being poor in this country. The hours on Centrelink, the hours in lines, the justification of menial amounts of money to make ends meet, the constant barrage and attack on your integrity and your rights and your worth as a human being. Trying to, we have a divide between the haves and the have-nots that is at its greatest than we've ever had. People who are living in housing commissions and having to make a decision about whether they put the power on or whether they have food in their belly. We just shouldn't be in that situation in Australia. And we are. And that is systemic. That is created by us as people. There's not good people and bad people in this world. We like to think there are, and we like to think that there's a prison, we'll lock up all the bad people and the rest of us are safe. Some of the people that I think have been the greatest violators of human rights are the most well-paid people around the world. They live in business. They work in business. They work in government. They, have privileged positions and jobs, and they maintain a status quo, and they don't challenge that status quo. And they have a human obligation too, because we have created circumstances that lock up the most vulnerable and impoverish the most vulnerable, when we should be actually bending our resources to support all of us, to have opportunity. There's no reason for anyone in this incredible country of ours to be living with that sort of stress.
Yeah. I spent a little bit of time visiting the juvie here in Melbourne, and that was kind of, yeah, witnessing from such a young age, these kids are just, yeah, they're not in school, and their parents might both be in prison, and then, of course, you know, then someone gets pregnant, they need money, like, of course, it's just like, they're just people who would make the same decisions that we would make if we were in that situation.
That's exactly right. People are making decisions to survive, and I don't, you know, unless you've been in that situation, people don't understand how hard that is. And it's very hard to plan for the future when you're making a decision to survive day in, day out. Do I have somewhere to live? Do I have a safe place for my children? Where can I go? You know, I worked in the women's prison, where for many of those women, being in prison was their respite from violence. You know, how's that as a life? When I get out, I'm going to be under so much pressure. I'm going to be facing this threat and that threat and the other threat. This is a place of time out. How can we be in a society where that is what we are offering to women? You know, so we know the violence against women in our country. We know that we have, you know, we have women being murdered all the time. And again, it's those who are excluded the most from the economic heart of the world, of our country, that are punished the most.
But yeah, this is why I'm so excited to talk to you, because you're such a solutions-focused person who is talking about the future and how it can change. And I love how you said, I've heard you say, we created this as people, which means we as people can also change it. So going back to so when did you end up going to the Northern Territory and then being passionate in this area?
Yeah, so that's another personal story, really. So, you know, many remote communities, a lot of people don't know this, but there's poor schooling. In some, there's no schooling. And in most, there's no secondary schooling. So if you're lucky enough in a remote Aboriginal community to have a primary school, which certainly isn't everywhere, many communities don't have access to. But if you're lucky enough to have one, you nearly always are not going to have a secondary school. There's only a few places in remote Australia that has secondary schooling access, or, you know, that a real opportunity. And, you know, I want to preface it by saying it's a schooling system that's not based on people's culture. So even with that schooling system, it's a foreign schooling system that people, if they have access to. But anyway, 40 years ago, and before 40 years ago, a lot of communities in the Northern Territory would send their kids interstate once they hit high school if they wanted to continue school. And that, I know of some of those places in Victoria, and I'm assuming that it happened, you know, kids went to other places. I know now some kids go to Queensland. There's a lot of kids going a lot of places around the country. But 40 years ago, there was a group of students from a community called Santa Teresa, which is 70 kilometres outside of Alice Springs, who were coming to Melbourne. Some had gone to Beechworth and others were coming into Melbourne. And a group of those students ended up at the school that my mother was a teacher at. So my mother was a teacher. And, you know, as I said before, my mother wasn't, you know, didn't stridently talk about colour, and probably didn't even fully understand it as a white woman, the impact of colour as you're growing up. But she, you know, so we never had those discussions as we were growing up in that way. But if I was the only person of colour, can you imagine what it was like coming from a remote school from the middle of Australia into those sort of same suburban areas? So the young women were fantastic, and my mother really is just simply the most beautiful human being I've ever known. I'm so lucky that she's my mother, and so she struck up a beautiful relationship with these students, and I think she just understood how hard it was. So they used to come to our place every week, and we would just, you know, be together, and we developed a very, very close relationship. And with one of the young women in particular, she was she was the same age as my older brothers, a couple of years older than me, but we just became they saw my mum as their mother as well. And later, when I understood about the importance of family, I understood why a whole family saw us as family, because that is what family do. So I really grew up through my adolescence with her as my sister in Melbourne. And when she'd go back to the Northern Territory, back then there were no mobile phones, there was no anything, there was like one little pay phone, and she'd find the money and we'd talk on the phone, and we kept in contact, and then family would come and visit and we would go and visit there. So it was very personal, actually. And she said, come and visit sometime, sister. And so it took me a long time, and we went backwards and forwards, and then after I'd worked in the prison for a few years, I said, I'll come up. So I just jumped on a train. I expected to come back to Melbourne. So I jumped on a train at the age of 27 just to go and hang out with her, and then I never came back. Really. I came back about 6 years ago, but to look after my mum and dad. But it was when I was living there, and whilst I had visited a number of times and gone, been out bush and, been hung out at community, but it wasn't until I was living there full time that the depth of the human rights abuses against First Nations people in this country were really revealed to me properly. And for me, it was an injustice, but it was also people that I loved. Yeah.
What were some of the most striking things you remember from the early days?
Oh, look, it continues today. It's like every minute of every day there's human rights abuse that's happening. It's in every single part of people's life. And I used to sort of say, I feel like this beautiful land that I was walking on was just soaked with the blood of First Nations people. And not just from history, but from today. The housing conditions, the overcrowding, everything. The racism, walking into places with my family and you can't come in here, you haven't got any shoes on. They're just shopping centres that people should have access to, with government services that people are being excluded from, and the shame that people felt everywhere. And to avoid that shame is just to withdraw. But the funerals, just funeral after funeral after funeral, over policing and the surveillance, and it just continues on and on. Like one of our young, when lived there, one of our young fellas, one of our sons, was, I had my sister at the time, I've got a number of First Nation sisters, and one of them rang and said they've taken, and it said the name, I'm not going to say his name, but welfare's come and taken him. I said, what? Oh yeah, they've come and taken him, yeah, sister. I said, well, they can't take him. I said, there's these grandmothers who are, he might have been struggling with his parents, but there were two amazing grandmothers living in the community looking after him, able to look after him. But welfare had gone out one day, and they'd been having meetings with them, and nobody knew they were coming to take the child. So they rock up and and he's gone. And I said, well, we've got to get him back. And so, but because I could navigate the Western system, I made phone calls, I made demands, I pushed so hard. And their justification was that he was going to the clinic and he was getting too skinny, like he was losing weight or something. And so then he goes in, he gets taken away and gets put in with a white family. During his time in care, because I couldn't get him back straight away, we couldn't, he's hospitalised. He's, but nobody is up in arms about the fact that he's hospitalised while in care of somebody else. Anyway, I don't know how we managed to do it, but we managed to get him back within a couple of weeks. Now he's this big, burly, beautiful man. Like he's, 20-something, mid-20s, and, we always hold each other really tightly because we all know that he might not have been with us, you know. And then later they found out that the scales at the clinic were not working properly. And, you know, but even if they were, he had family who could look after him. So these were just, you know, then the police and police harassment and, you know, maybe 10 years ago we had the police, you know, we had one of our young fellas who, yes, he was, you know, doing the wrong thing and the police tried to catch him and he was being too cheeky and he escaped from police custody and he wasn't violent, but he, you know, was doing the wrong thing and he was thieving and, you know, they were trying to get him in custody and that's their job, which is okay. But they were so annoyed with the fact that he kept escaping custody that they just went on a rampage of our family in town and out at Santa Teresa, and they would go in the middle of the night and they would take the dogs in and they would knock on people's houses and they'd walk into homes and they would terrorise people and they would threaten people and they would threaten his, you know, wife, if you don't tell us where he is, we're going to take your child. And one time they put this laser gun and pointed at the head of one of our kids in their family, you know. And so again, you know, I put the complaint in and the complaint was recognised and was accepted and an apology came. But that's because I can navigate those systems. This sort of stuff is happening to people. You know, one day this old woman, incredible, beautiful old woman, who I just worked so closely with, an amazing law woman, like really incredible, holder of Arrernte law and dance and song, and there was a number of us that had established this place called the Healing Centre to protect, uphold and strengthen First Nation systems of health and wellbeing because it's so brilliant. But anyway, one day I rocked up to her place and it was surrounded by 20 military dressed men and probably women too, and defence type vehicles and camouflage stuff and flak jackets, and they said they had a sniper in the garage. This isn't a town camp. A little old woman who's so beautiful that if you knocked on her door she'd go yes, and if you asked her a question she'd give you an answer. And there had been an horrific rape the night before. There's no, you know, that's fine. So they're looking for somebody. So, but they've brought in a heavy armed artillery to surround this old woman's house because they thought this young fellow was in the house. Invisibility of all the kids and all the families of that whole community, when they could have gone to the door and knocked on the door. So it's that stuff, but the stuff that people don't see, that First Nations people live with all the time, threats to their families, threats to their security, under surveillance, never feeling safe. So that was Alice Springs for me, and it continues today. It's more police now than it ever has been, and it isn't creating safety for First Nations people or non-First Nations people. And we have embedded the racism and we've embedded the exclusion. And for 20 years, there's this big town camp there, hundreds of kids. I first went to Canberra over 20 years ago to say, this is the pathway. We need something here with these kids to get, you know, even if they're getting to school there 5 years behind. Let's invest in the children and the families in this town camp that's like as big as a suburb. Let's have a fabulous facility here. And today there is still nothing.
So you said, okay, I'm going to figure out how to do this myself. If the government's not going to...
Well, it wasn't even myself. Like, it's not me that's done this. Like, I have had the privilege of working alongside the most phenomenal First Nations leaders. The people who walked the rights movement in the 70s that established the Aboriginal organisations. They were in their later years when I went to Alice Springs, and I just shut my mouth and listened. And these are great visionaries, incredible strategists. They speak English as second, third or fourth language, so most people don't go and sit down and talk to them or listen to what they have to say, but they've had solutions for decades and decades and decades and decades. So this wasn't me. This was me just watching the landscape and going, how is it that everybody's ignoring this voice? It is so clear what people want. It is so clear what the injustice is. It is actually so clear what the solution is. It is not as hard as everybody thinks it is. So we worked together, and I worked with those senior people over a 20-year period around a range of things. And what came out of that was Children's Grant.
And what does the solution look like? Or I guess what, and then how from today, because it's this 25-year horizon, which is so good because it's not just, some band-aid solution, it's like structural change. What then is your vision for 30 years from now? Like, what would these communities ideally look like?
Well, the families say, there's no rocket science in it. If you asked any family of any colour around the world, they would say the same. And our families say, we want our kids to know their land, their language, their culture. We want them to have great jobs. We want them to be healthy. We want them to be strong in their identity. It's really simple. So if you then go, okay, how do we achieve that in 20 years? Then you work backwards from that. And you want to do that across for a whole community. And that community has really clear governance and leadership. So First Nations communities are pretty small in the Northern Territory in terms of population size. No reason why every single child can't have an incredible life journey. So, and Aboriginal governance is through the land, so it's community by community in that sense. So people know the governance of the land, the law of the land where they live. So you start from there. The rightful people who can speak for that land, the rightful senior cultural people. Aboriginal people live, know and still continue their law today. Just most people don't see it. And it's a very strong law. As I say, our law has been in place for 65,000 years. White law comes and goes and changes, but we have a very strict law. And that law comes from the land and defines your responsibilities from pre-birth, your identity, your responsibilities, where you belong. So we build the education system and the legal systems and the health systems around those laws and practices that have been practiced for over 65,000 years. And they are health systems and they're education systems and they're legal systems. And we place that in the centre and we make sure every single child has an incredible opportunity. That's what we want to make sure. We're still not quite there. We've still got a long way to go to make that a reality. But it's a possibility. So that's how simple the solution is. In every community, every child waking up in the morning, surrounded by their culture and language with fabulous early childhood, fabulous education pathway, fabulous health access, and secure in their cultural identity and around their families and their law so they grow up. So that's all we're putting in place, what Aboriginal people have said forever. And we've created a system and a structure to enable that, to create the space for local people to fill it with our leadership and to back them in with the resources. And we start with a strength-based, with the ability-based. We don't look at the deficit. We don't go, our whole system in the West is siloed-based, deficit-based. There's something wrong with you. How do we fix you? Well, we look at our children and we go, they're brilliant and they're amazing. How do we create a platform for them to exercise their brilliance? So we want every child to be able to wake up and go, this is where we're going today. And they have a place of safety and their family are there and it's intergenerational, which it always has been. And the elders are there because the policies for First Nations people and the practices say you can't have a child without an adult. You can't have a little one without the elders. So you have to have the intergenerational space. And once you see that filled, men, women, elders, adults, young people, kids and babies, that has a whole responsibility line. We put kids in the age group year 1, year 2, year 3, and we wonder why there's a whole lot of bullying because we put all these kids in the same age group and say get along. Well, First Nations learning has evolved for 65,000 years. It's phenomenally brilliant, leading practice. And as a psychologist, early childhood development is way more superior to the way we do it in the West. So what we're doing is enabling those systems of knowledge. And once you create the space, because people live them, it just comes to life and people have a sense of freedom then and people gain their confidence of voice and governance. But it's no different to what we do in the West. great education, a safe home, families working, so jobs and employment, economic opportunity, really strong in your identity, knowing that you belong and having opportunities to make decisions for the future that are independent of government or anybody else. That's where people want to be. So that's our 25-year plan, is that we want a generation of children to experience that. Because once you have a generation of children experiencing opportunity as a whole, that whole community will shift into the future. And it'll be their children where that's the norm.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then I guess it's like the symptoms of the system that isn't working, which is like suicide and lower life expectancy and alcoholism, and all of this will kind of just naturally dissolve because the community is way stronger. And
it's all about prevention. We won't have succeeded if those things aren't prevented. We don't want to see. We believe that if this is supported in the right way for long enough, and we hold it for long enough, we will prevent kids going into care. We'll prevent kids going into incarceration. We'll prevent chronic illness and early death. We'll prevent incarceration. We will create economic opportunity. We'll create a sense of justice and rights and belonging and freedoms, So yeah, absolutely, that's exactly right.
I have so many more questions for you, but I know you have to go, so I'll just ask you the last three, which are quick ones about you. The first one is, how do you stay grounded day to day?
Oh, because I work with, know and live with incredible people who I have the deepest regard. I feel like one of the luckiest people in this world. I have been able to, and I still work with one of the knowledge holders of a system that's over 65,000 years in the making, MK Turner. She lives that knowledge system. She lives and breathes it and knows it. No, how, and this is a woman who has buried her children and buried her grandchildren, who still lives in a shitty, overcrowded house because we haven't been able to work out a system that can support her to live with her family with dignity. And she wakes up every day with the generosity of spirit beyond comparison and works tirelessly for her. So it is not hard when you know people like that and they are your heroes, and your little problem of a given day and you're tired and whatever is complete self-indulgent, and you look at, sort of look at people like MK or William, who's our chair, or any the young people, my mother. It's all of those people that make it real. And so I feel very, very lucky, and I have complete freedom. I don't have to do this. I want to do it. And a lot of people don't have those freedoms of choice. So I feel also a very deep responsibility, because I feel that those of us who are privileged in this country, it is our responsibility to bust our gut until we create equity and justices and freedoms. That's actually our responsibility of people who have come into this land and who live with the privilege of living on this country while our first peoples still live with deep injustice. So that keeps me grounded.
Second question, is there a book that's had a big impact on your life?
Oh, that's an interesting one. My mother was an English teacher. I love books. I don't think for me it's the books. I mean, I've read lots of books that I love. Probably one of the books that I love the most is MK's book, which is Humanitarian. What does it mean to be an Aboriginal person? It's like the foundation for children's ground and what we turn to always. But I think it's the people that I've met. I'm a people person. It's sitting and feeling and being with people that influence me, and who the strength and resilience of people who face the greatest, orchestrated exclusions in this country, but find a way to, have the most often, people who we often think are the most vulnerable from my point of view are usually the strongest and most powerful people I've ever met, because what they've endured and how they've created resolutions for themselves and how they walk through the world, and the old people in particular, their dignity and their graciousness and their generosity of spirit, that's what probably has had the greatest impact on me.
Last question, what 3 words describe the best version of you?
Oh, me? Oh my God. I don't know what the best version of me. I think I'm still finding the best version of me. I usually look at the things I still need to be working on. I don't know. Best version of me? Yeah, that's a hard. I don't know that I could find 3 words. Love is a big one for me. Yeah, I think, I say it in the organisation all the time that we don't speak to it enough, but if we really show love and respect for people, we can actually find solutions. If that's pure, we'll find the solution. So I think love and respect are 2 really important words for me.
Third one?
Third one?
Surely justice makes the cut.
Hey?
Surely the sense of justice.
Yeah, I guess so. But for me, if you can be successful in creating an environment of respect, then what comes with that is justice. So if we really respected one another, if we respected those who are behind bars, if we respected women, if we respected First Nations people, if we respected refugees, it's a respect thing, and through that I think breeds justice, because if you don't respect somebody, then you're not going to challenge your own worldview, to create that equity. I don't know what the third word is. I might sleep on that.
And then if people want to find out more about Children's Ground or support you guys, because importantly, right, it is a charity, it relies on...
what makes what we do amazing is that we've stepped outside of the system, and it's the donations from people in the general community who allow us to do things differently, and we have to do things differently. The status quo doesn't cut it. The status quo is killing people. But we are finding that by privileging first cultural language, people, governance, voice, by creating environments of equity, that we're seeing, people who've never worked before, and young people finding their confidence and identity, and kids enjoying learning, and all of those things that just should be part of life. And we want to create that. And also it allows us to do the things in the way that we need, and be responsive to our realities. We lost so many people last year. We had funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral. So while you're building a pathway for reform, you're still dealing with the day-to-day challenges that everybody has to live with. So yeah, it's those donations from the general public that keep us going and are our lifeblood, really.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.